Hi, everyone, and welcome to our third week of CRISPR-Con. Welcome to any new participants who are tuning in for the first time, and welcome back to those of you who have attended past sessions. As some of you know, I'm Mallory Huggins with the Keystone Policy Center, and as usual, I will be getting us started today with some grounding remarks and then turning things over to our moderator and panelists. Keystone Policy Center is a third-party, nonprofit, non-advocacy institution that has spent about 45 years helping to bring diverse perspectives to bear on decisions in food and agriculture, natural resources, health, education, energy, and more. Our mission is to inspire leaders to reach common higher ground. Keystone is based in Keystone, Colorado, on the lands of the Ute people, and I'm part of the Keystone team that's based in Washington, D.C., on land that was once occupied by the Nacotchtank people. We are proud at Keystone to help facilitate CRISPR-Con's conversations on science, society, and the future of gene editing. The mission of CRISPR-Con is to create a unique forum of diverse voices across a variety of applications in health, agriculture, conservation, and more. With CRISPR-Con, we're all about conversation, not consensus. We aim to highlight many perspectives and experiences, spark curiosity, build understanding, and share societal histories and other contexts that we think is relevant to decisions on gene editing technologies. 2020 is our fourth year, and in this virtual format, we have 10 webinars and 5 themes over 2 months, plus additional discussion through our Ideas Marketplace. Those are breakout sessions led by participants. We are hosting a broad-ranging lineup of speakers and topics throughout these 2 months of programming. And while we know that we can't hear from everybody, we do hope that our lineup helps demonstrate the diversity of voices and issues that are part of the conversation on gene editing. So for this week, our third week, our halfway point with this virtual series, the theme is hope and hype. And with this theme, we're aiming to unpack the degree of speculation on the benefits and harms of gene editing and how the technology, product development, and governance in one geography or sector might affect the global trajectory of gene editing as a whole. We're asking questions about what can be learned from missteps, slowdowns, and breakthroughs in different sectors and geographies. On Thursday, that will look like exploring gene editing research and development in the agriculture sector. So then we'll be talking about gene-edited products that have come to market or are likely to arrive soon, how potential societal benefits have been prioritized, if at all, within research, and how those benefits can be assessed. But for today, we are focusing on gene editing research and governance and how it's progressing in China, as well as how those trends are affecting research and governance in the rest of the world. We will hear first for a little under an hour and a half from our panelists in dialogue with our moderator, and then we'll transition to a few breakout sessions in Ideas Marketplace from 10:30 to 11 Eastern. So please plan to stick around for those, and I'll share more information about how to access those sessions in our closing remarks. We want to thank our sponsors for supporting the mission of CRISPR-Con and our ability to host these important conversations. Our overall programmatic sponsors are Corteva and United Soybean Board, and a sponsor specific to this week is Genus. You can learn more about this week's partners and sponsors and access featured past CRISPR-Con content in our expo. So feel free to visit that expo anytime after this session and between now and Thursday. We hope that the dialogue will bring out lots of lively discussion and debate among the panelists and the participants. If you're joining us via Hopin, you can use the stage chat to submit questions and comments at any time. And if you're viewing on YouTube, welcome. Unfortunately, you won't be able to submit questions and comments, but you'll be able to watch the whole session live along with us. Divergence and disagreement are welcome always, but we also ask that everyone be curious, engaged, and respectful as you share different perspectives. So at this time, I'm going to begin inviting our moderator and panelists to join me on stage. Lee Witkowski first will be our moderator. Lee is a project and policy analyst at the Innovative Genomics Institute, a longtime partner of CRISPR-Con. Lee has a BA in chemistry from Willamette University and received her PhD from UC Berkeley, working in Robert Tijan's lab. Her doctoral work focused on mechanisms of human transcription and the influence of chromatin on CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing. Lee joined IGI in September 2017 as a science policy analyst, looking at the regulatory landscape as it relates to new genetic engineering technologies and societal aspects of biotechnology development and adoption. And as you can see from her bio, Lee worked at the intersection of science, society, and policy issues on gene editing. She's not an expert on gene editing in China, but as a longtime partner, we've asked Lee to help channel the curiosity of our CRISPR-Con audience, most of whom are based outside of China, in helping us move beyond hype and headlines and toward a deeper understanding of research governance and societal context for gene editing in China. Thank you, Lee. Thank you. I am now going to introduce our speakers, but I'll introduce them just very briefly with title and affiliation because they'll be sharing their backgrounds as we begin the panel. So first up, we have Larry Au, who is a PhD candidate in sociology from Columbia University. His dissertation is focused on the diffusion and uptake of precision medicine in China. Larry will ask you to share audio and video now. And then next up, we have Yang Cheng, who is a particle physicist, a writer covering contemporary China, and a postdoctoral research associate at Cornell University. And third, we have Judy Wang, who is retired, but was most recently the senior manager of biotech affairs and regulatory at DuPont Pioneer China. We were also planning to have Xiaomei Zai on this panel, but unfortunately she was able to join. We do know we'll have a great conversation with these three panelists, and I will now remove myself from the screen so that I can turn it over to them. So have a great conversation, everyone.
All right, thanks, Mallory. So let's start maybe by having all of you tell us a little bit more about yourselves and the work that you've done and sort of what brings you here today. So let's start with, if you want to go first.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone on the line. Yeah, I'm Judy Wong. I'm based in Beijing from China. It's a long history for me to introduce myself since I'm successfully retired from the Dow DuPont Ag Division. Now is a new company we call the Corteva. So actually, I graduated from biology department of Hangzhou University, the Life Science College of Zhejiang University now. And my first job actually is working at the Zhejiang Environmental Protection Institute located in Hangzhou, which is called the Paradise on the Earth, a beautiful city in East China. And then I moved to IRI, the International Rice Research Institute based in Philippines with my husband. So after I got married, so where I got my master's degree from University of the Philippines. And then I joined CAS, the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences in 1996, when my husband and with the whole family, we moved back to Beijing, and where I got my PhD degree on molecular biology from CAS. And then my work is focused on the agriculture biotechnology since then. And I joined the DuPont Pioneer in 2005. My major responsibility was biotech affairs and regulatory. I have been working on gene editing advocacy work since 2015, when DuPont Pioneer got the first gene editing crop of waxy corn. And I was the epic director of Dow DuPont Ag Division after Dow and DuPont merged in 2016, and then retired from this position in 2018. But now I'm continue being hired as the senior consultant to Corteva Ag Division, Ag Science, which is the new company name from Dow DuPont Ag Division. That's all my brief.
Great, thank
career.
you. It's great to have you. And Yang, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself as well?
Sure. Hi, I'm Yaya Wang. So I'm a particle physicist by training and trade. I should clarify that I do not have technical knowledge on biology. It was my second worst subject in high school. I was born and raised in China. I received my undergraduate degree from the University of Science and Technology of China and my PhD in physics from the University of Chicago. I'm now a postdoctoral scholar at Cornell. And on the other hand, I have been writing about science and science policy in China and its global implications for the past few years for a wide range of publications. And I've written about bioethics in China in particular, the gene editing case of He Jiankui, as well as covering the COVID-19 pandemic for a wide range of publications, including the New York Times, Foreign Policy, and MIT Technology Review. So I think my interface with this topic partly is from my writing, but partly I should mention here that I shared the same undergraduate alma mater as He Jiankui, and he was 3 years ahead of me in college. And I didn't know him personally, but I think it's something interesting to think about as scientists in a wide range of disciplines, how we approach the topic of ethics and how we think about topics of technological arrogance. And then also as a Chinese woman, how as a minority scientist, our bodies are being defined and used by the state. So these are my backgrounds with regards to gene editing.
Thank you, great to have you. Larry, can you tell us some more about yourself?
Yeah. Hey everyone, I'm Larry Yao. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at Columbia University. My dissertation looks at the uptake and diffusion of precision medicine in China. So precision medicine was a concept that was proposed in the US for the most part by the national academies, taken up by the Obama administration. So I was interested at the time and to see how this concept was taken up by different actors in China, how it's taken on different meanings. So my work mostly relies on a lot of interlocutors in China who I talk to a lot about how they've adapted these technologies, how they've interacted with the state, different private actors, the public. So at the time when the controversy around He Jiankui came about, everyone was up in arms talking about it. So that's a little bit about how I got looped in. Also, not a scientist and not a bioethicist, so a little bit of an outsider in a lot of regards.
Great, well, it's great to have you all. So let's jump in. I think the first question that we want to address is sort of a landscape question. I know many people are curious and really want to know what sort of work is happening in China, what's being developed. You know, China has been a leader in technology and science, but it's often unsure for many people what exactly is happening and what the new waves of development are. So maybe let's start there. So what sort of gene editing products in health, agriculture, or other things are in development in China? And which of these do you think are the most promising, or which create sort of the most buzz or the most hype? And maybe I'll start with Judy. If you could talk maybe a little bit about what's in development in the crop biotech space, particularly for gene editing, and what do you see as the most promising, but also maybe the most hyped or most wrought issues associated with those coming out of China?
Okay. Actually, there are many gene editing, maybe not a final product, but many research work are going on, development in China. For example, I'm not familiar with the health sector or gene editing the animal, but for the crops, almost all the major crops, including like rice, corn, wheat, soybean, etc. All these traits the Chinese scientists are working on, and the major traits they focus on are, for example, first is enhance the yield, like rice and corn and other crops, and second is improve quality, because with the Chinese people's living standard increase and they like have good quality product, so improve quality, and then is the improve crop disease resistance, and then fourth is improve the herbicide tolerance, and then fifth is the application in crop breeding, because this gene editing technology that can be used as a tool to accelerate the breeding process. And then some of the scientists, they're also working on the stress tolerance. So these are the major product they are working on. But I heard that the good progress in product is enhance the yield, improve quality, and improve the disease resistance.
Great. Great. And Larry, it sounds like you've done some analysis on what's in the pipeline. Could you talk a little bit about what you know is coming through and what is sort of the most buzzed about or hyped as well?
So I'm more familiar, I think, with the scientific parts of it, less familiar with the industry parts of CRISPR. But just from looking at a lot of the bibliometric analysis of output generated by scientists in China around CRISPR, definitely the majority of publications are related to agricultural research. But in the medical spaces, there's, I think, a lot of research that's going on, especially around oncology and cancers. These are, I think, when talking to Chinese scientists, mostly around diseases that a lot of Chinese scientists feel are neglected by Western researchers in America and Europe. So these are diseases that are of higher incidence among Chinese populations. So I think one of the more hyped research projects that was going on back in 2016 was a CRISPR trial of injecting PD-1 edited T cells into small cell lung cancer patients by a researcher in Sichuan University by Liu You. So that was one of the first times. And subsequently, since then, a lot of the CRISPR gene therapy trials have also been taking place in China as well too. Yeah, so also around a lot of other diseases that are very high prevalence, not just in cancers, but also in hypertension, in beta thalassemia, and a lot of more infectious diseases that are still, like hepatitis B, that are still very much going on in China right now too.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what you see as driving that innovation process. You mentioned that there's some focus on diseases that are felt to be not properly given enough attention outside of China. And is that, do you think, the major driver? Or what sort of things are contributing to the new technologies and new applications coming out of China?
So I think one of the major drivers would be the policy emphasis shift towards chronic disease management in the past 4 or 5 years that's happened in China. So that's detailed in a lot of national key planning documents like Healthy China 2030. So that's recognized as one of the perhaps after effects of modernization and urbanization in China. A lot of these diseases have crept up. So it's become, I think, more policymakers and scientific and medical professionals have realized that that's something that's coming up on the horizon. And there's a sense that in order to manage this looming crisis, there's a lot that needs to be done and to prepare for that in the side of basic scientific research and medical research. So part of it is that too.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And Yang, could you maybe talk a little bit about what you're seeing in your writing and what you see as maybe the driving forces behind some of the directions of innovation?
Yeah, so I think instead of like a product overviewing a particular area, since it's not my topic of expertise, I will talk a bit more following up on your question about innovation. And in particular, talk about like the interfaces of education, government, and private industry. And I'll talk about this through one example, which is He Jiankui's gene sequencing company, Direct Genomics. And so he was educated in China and then in the US, and then he was recruited back to China. And so the talent recruitment program sponsored by the Chinese government have been receiving a lot of attention in the US. And most of the attention have been on the central government's program, for example, 1,000 Talent. However, it's interesting to note that He Jiankui was recruited by Shenzhen city's local talent recruitment program, the Peacock Plan. So there is a diversity of landscapes from the central government to the local. And then he was recruited to a new university, the Southern University of Science and Technology, SUSTech. And that was modeled after Stanford. At least there was the ambition. So it was encouraging scientists and academics to devote also energy into become enterprising and set up companies. And He was very much on top of that. And he set up the new company, Direct Genomics, very quickly after he went back to China. And he was sourcing this technology from his former advisor at Stanford, this gene sequencing technology, and it's repackaged. There is some engineering effort, but the core technology was from an American company that went bankrupt. However, and that was, and he used part of his startup funding from the government. On the other hand, but it was a private company. On the other hand, after his company developed this product, repackaged product, he received a lot of propaganda coverage in Chinese state media, and that was billed as a kind of like the first in Asia or one of the foremost in the world. And so this also drives this, when you mentioned the incentive system, or that whether or not it was completely new technology, it's still being used by the government in this way.
Great, thank you. I think, yeah. So let's actually directly address this question, because I think it's one on the minds of many people. And some watching this may not be as familiar with who He Jiankui is and what exactly happened. So let's just jump into that and address it. So could somebody, I don't know if Yang, maybe you want to give a quick overview on what exactly happened and why we're talking about him right now.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned a bit about his education background, and I think it was very important that he was trained as a physicist, both for his undergraduate and for his graduate degree, though he moved a bit to like biostatistics. And then he was interested in biology and in particular genetics, as what partly driven by personal ambition and seeing this as a more lucrative opportunity than theoretical physics, which he studied in the beginning. And after he went back to China, as I mentioned, he set up the gene sequencing company and a variety of other companies. And he received a lot of attention from Chinese state media and a lot of propaganda behind it. And I think in a way that also boosted his ego and his ambition. So what he moved forward was he recruited a group of parents who the prospective father is HIV positive and the mother is a prospective mother is not, and these couples under Chinese regulations cannot receive fertility treatment because the regulation bans people with major infectious diseases or major disabilities. So he was taking advantage of this eugenics policy in general, and then he was offering fertility treatment to these HIV positive couples. But in the process of this, he was applying CRISPR-Cas9 technology to the embryos, or his team was doing that, and in particular to target a gene sequence that would give the person, the baby, natural immunity to HIV. And so he recruited a number of couples, but in the end there were 3 babies were born, a pair of twins and then another child. And the news broke at the end of 2018. I believe one of the reporter who broke the news spoke at this conference as well, Antonio Ralgado at MIT Technology Review, and it was covered extensively by Associated Press as well. And then I should also mention that after the news broke, the Chinese bioethics community, the Chinese scientific community, which regrettably we are not hearing from Professor Xiaomei Zhai today, but she and her colleagues, and there was a broad pushback against this absolutely unethical behavior. And so we should not view He Jiankui as one individual, as representing the Chinese scientific community. And he basically went incommunicado for the entire year of 2019. At the end of 2019, the Chinese government announced that he and two of his colleagues are sentenced to a lengthy prison sentence. And this is interesting here because they were sentenced under the charge of practicing medicine without a license. And so it was actually, I think, a regrettably missed opportunity that the actual issues and the ethical thorny ethical questions with regards to gene editing on humans are not being addressed through this speedy and non-transparent trial. And that's it.
Thank you for that overview. I wonder, you know, Judy, you were in China when this was happening. How did you perceive what was happening? How did you hear about it? And has that had any ripple effects in the agriculture space? Or has anything changed from the sort of news of unethical behavior in agriculture? Has it moved beyond the health space to have implications elsewhere?
Actually, we did not see any direct impact to agriculture gene editing part of this He Jiankui incident. But I think the government will take, in general, will take a very precautious regulation to gene editing products, not only for animal or for health science, but also for agriculture. That's one of the indirect impact to agriculture. And regarding to your earlier question about what are the driving force innovation on gene editing on crop, I think maybe from agriculture part, China is such a big agriculture country, and we have occupied 20% of the world's population, but we only have 80% of the world's arable land, and 5% of the world's freshwater resource. So increase productivity, increase the yield, and also increase the quality of the food of the agriculture product is always our top priority. So that's the driving force for the innovation in agriculture.
Great. And Larry, how have you perceived the event that Yang just described for us, the first gene-edited babies being born? And how do you see that? What does it tell us about governance in China?
I think, is my mic on?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
We can hear you.
I think that this goes back to an earlier point that Yang made about how innovation in China is a lot of different regions, different sectors, different industries experimenting, even though there's in some ways a top-down direction of which areas should be emphasized. It really relies on a lot of implementation and experimentation for policymakers and scientists to figure out which are acceptable routes to go. One of the anthropologists at Harvard University, Susan Greenhow, has a phrase about policymaking in China in science that usually slogan comes first before policy documents and implementation. And that's definitely true, I think, in this area as well, too. But that being said, I think that it's also a shame that Xiao Meizhan wasn't here today or couldn't make it. I think what her and her colleagues did and other biomedical ethicists and medical professionals did to come out to speak out against what He Jiankui did was very much brave. I think if they hadn't reacted so quickly, we might have seen public opinion diverge a little bit more. But I think the early intervention of a lot of these experts who are very much plugged into global conversations around the ethical and moral implications of gene editing, because of their intervention, the Chinese public was able to understand what happened was not permissible and not permitted at all.
Could you describe a little bit on what exactly was said and when and how you perceived that as being influential to public opinion about the event?
Yeah, so I think when the crisis erupted, right, a lot of policymakers didn't know how to respond. And this is from reading Xiaomi's own writings. about her accounts in the first like 24, 40 hours after the event. She kept on getting calls from a lot of different policymakers about how they should respond. So they were doing a lot of work behind the scenes, I think, to persuade the authorities that what was done was not allowed and should not be allowed. So they published a lot of very strong statements. The Chinese Academy of Sciences, the top academic institution in China, the pinnacle of science, came out and decried the actions as being against the regulations in China, that what He did was irresponsible, insane, and all of that, and really cast him out, right? Of course, in some ways, that's also to make sure that a lot of, the damage that was done by He didn't blow back on the rest of Chinese science, and that Chinese science as an enterprise wasn't seen as bad science by the international community, right? But regardless of that, I think it's still very much courageous. There's a lot of op-eds that he published in the Lancet Nature that touch on this subject, and those are all, I think, really forceful statements that helped guide policymakers and the public's reaction to this incident.
I know.
And if I may,
go for it.
Oh, sorry. If I may add one little detail, right? After He Jiankui's the news broke, there was one article on People's Daily Online from Chinese official media that was praising this experiment as this breakthrough from Chinese scientists, the world's first. And that article was very quickly taken down after this news quickly rolled out into an international scandal. So this was a case where the Chinese government was susceptible to public opinion from pushback from the scientific community in China, but as well as from the international scientific community, since it cares about its international reputation, but also from the Chinese general public, as there was a lot of voices speaking against this unethical behavior online as well.
I know, unfortunately, Xiaomei could not be here, but she and her colleagues, as you mentioned, Larry, have published a number of highly visible articles about what has happened. And she mentioned, you know, this is maybe a crossroads for China and for the governance of genome editing. She expressed hope that there would be some changes in regulation and in the way this technology is being applied. Is that something that we're seeing already? Is there any movement towards revisiting regulations or revisiting ethical codes, etc.? I don't know if anybody wants to take that.
I think I actually did not pay some attention on that, but I heard from the Ministry of Science Technology and also from the China National Health Commission. They have announced some statement and strengthen the management and and also the approval on the ethical approval for all these studies on gene editing or biotech. That is, they announced this kind of requirements immediately.
So we're already seeing changes happening. That's great.
Yes, yes, yeah.
I'm actually going to incorporate a couple of these questions coming through the chat because I think they're very relevant. There's a question related to sort of the motivations and the drivers of the innovation that's happening. And it touches on sort of the history of the role of birth defects and how mutations in the genome are viewed by the public and what role that has with respect to the types of diseases, the types of mutations that are being addressed or in the pipeline to be addressed by genome editing. Has the perception of birth defects changed in China in the last 10 or 20 years, or what in general is the public perception of birth defects and mutations in the genome? I don't know, Larry, could you take that one?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So I recommended a book to the audience member who submitted that question. It's from Frank Decoder, Imperfect Conceptions, Medical Knowledge and Birth Defects in China. It's a wonderful book that really talks about the concerns about population quality that guides a lot of population and medical interventions in China. but the audience member, I think, has also read that book and is asking for a little bit newer works that also touch on the topic. So I think there's been a lot of work around the ideas of what Suzhi, or like population quality, really means in terms of medical interventions and population policies. I would recommend A.O. Wahlberg's book, Good Quality, which looks at sperm banking in China, studying the ways in which reproductive technologies are conceived by medical professionals and the technical staff there, but also by the general public. And I think the concerns about population quality definitely is impacted by the ways in which CRISPR as the technology is imagined as a potential solution or cure to these perceived problems. But I think one of the things that I want to flag is that the ways in which that we think about what are rare diseases or what are diseases that are worthy of intervention with CRISPR-assisted technologies obviously differs across national contexts as well too, right? And there's been some that's been written about the stigma around HIV/AIDS, about the history of HIV/AIDS in China, that really motivated towards He Jiankui's thinking along that area too, right? About how as a disease in the West, it's seen as a chronic disease that can be managed through effective mobilizations. But in China, it's still seen as a disease that you would want to avoid at all costs, right? And if we take He Jiankui's writing seriously about why he decided to do this, a lot of along the lines of those like ethical thinkings would have guided his actions as well too.
If I may follow up a bit on that as well. So I think when we think about public opinion in China, and it's very important to both recognize that there is a cultural context, but also not essentialize it and think that the Chinese people are somehow unique and then have unique attitudes towards the body and towards medical intervention. And if we actually want to if we want to look at traditional Chinese culture, if we look at Taoism or Confucianism, then they're actually speaking very strongly against these kinds of invasive medical procedures. However, this doesn't really play that much of an important role on Chinese public opinion towards medical intervention, towards the body at the moment. I think partly a lot of this is driven by the government, but also driven by national conditions, right? When the Chinese government, and this is not just the current government, but even starting in the 20th century, when at the fall of the Chinese Empire, and then rebuilding a modern state. And there is this strong notion of connecting a strong individual body with the idea of a strong nation. And that plays a lot into later, after the communist takeover, as Larry mentioned, this concept of suzhi, of the quality of the human being. And we can see some parallels in the former Soviet Union as well. And then with regards to attitudes towards birth defects and disabilities. And I think a lot of this is also related with the condition of the society and also with policies. For example, the one-child policy that played a lot into the idea of if we can only have one child, then what is desirable. And so I think a lot of these public opinions are being shaped by the policies and being shaped by a scarcity, a mindset of scarcity as well.
That's very interesting. I wonder, speaking of sort of the public opinion and what's shaping that, I wonder, Judy, could you tell us a little bit about public opinion towards genome editing in crops and how it may be different or how it relates to predecessor technologies like genetically modified organisms? What sort of public opinion are you seeing and how is that playing out in the regulatory space?
Yeah, I think China, the public perception really very negatively impact the progress of the biotech crops, for example, transgenic crops. It's already since 2004, and now is with the progress of gene editing plants, particularly after the He Jiankui incident. I think there are many people who was against biotech before, now they also move to against the gene editing products. So they are regularly publish some negative papers or some rumor stories about how the gene editing the plants have bad characteristic, or how it will damage in the entire biodiversity, or damage the entire ecosystem. So this kind of rumor story is always going on. So it's really from the science perspective, it's really it will hurt the agriculture and also delay the access of Chinese farmers to this advanced technology. Because the biotech crop, a transgenic crop, is already an event happened in China. So until now, only the BT corn commercialized. All the other crops, even the Chinese scientists has reached a very good milestone achievements. For example, the BT rice, and also the phytase corn, and now is the BT corn. The Ministry of Agriculture already issued the safety certificate, but still not final approval for commercial cultivation yet. So I think the public perception to the biotech crops already have some kind of impact. So for the Chinese government to adopt this technology. So this is also one of my concerns.
So you just described the BT trait and these crops that have been taken through the regulatory system in China. Do we know what regulations there will be for genome edited crops, and will they be different from the previous transgenic crops?
There's no any official announcement yet to gene editing crops regulation in China, but through our workshop and science communication with the policymakers, with the government officials, or some of the key scientists, and maybe they are working on this gene editing plants regulation, and in general, in principle, they according to the current Chinese biotech regulation, that said anything which is genetically modified or through this process will be defined as GMO. So they feel that gene editing crop is still in the scope of GMO, but for some of the kind of, for example, SDN1, SDN2, only a gene deletion, a single base deletion, and there's no any foreign DNA introduced, maybe can consider in a simplified process, but there's no any official announcements to this regulation yet. So I'm not sure what kind of policy will take place in the final stage, but they are working on that.
So it sounds like there is a fairly strong sentiment against genetically modified organisms in the public in China. Has the genome editing technology kind of reached the public perception yet? Or are people starting to think about what exactly genome editing means for crops with respect to GMO in the public sphere? Is that in discussion, or is it still sort of focusing on genetically modified organisms and the previous technologies? So has genome editing kind of risen to the level of the public dialogue in China?
Yeah, in China, I think it's different from the other countries. Both for biotech, for transgenic, or for gene editing, if some of the scientists, if they are really good scientists, they know the technology, and they support, but they will not publish any papers on media, said, oh, I support. They just support by themselves. And then the people, there's some scientists, they are not really familiar with this technology at all, but they want to have some kind of a showcase, and they will write a paper. So maybe Yang is smiling. Yeah, they really like write papers on some journal. Said, oh, this technology is not good, or I have concern, or some. They just want to draw attention to the public. And then some ordinary people is not. They have no any technology background. They just listen to this we call 大 V is a big V VIP. They just see the opinion leader. They just see watch this opinion leader write some paper. They just follow it. So it's very complicated. Yeah, this technology is really so complicated. So people are difficult to understand. So I think this really is it's a long way to go, and also it's a trust to be built. Yeah.
Yang, do you want to add?
Yeah, I might add, because I am not going to talk about the technical aspect since I don't have the technical knowledge, but it's interesting, right? For example, anecdotally, my mother very much believes that, my mother who lives in China very much believes that genetically modified crops, and she also, and I think she also can't distinguish what type of genetically modified, whether it's gene editing or a more previous technology, right? Most people don't. And she thinks it's a bioweapon from the United States. And it's a very prevalent view among the Chinese public. And I think it is very, very interesting because we know that in China, the public information environment is tightly controlled by the government, tightly monitored and tightly controlled by the government. So even if some kind of rumor or view that is wrong and it's not endorsed by the government, but the very fact that it can exist on the Chinese internet sphere shows some kind of tacit allowing it to exist. And then I think that is interesting as well. And with regards to these public figures with a big social media following can say things that are deeply irresponsible. And they are still being allowed to say these opinions, even if they heard Chinese government policy, as Judy mentioned, with regards to approving these crops. But on the other hand, on the Chinese public, I think we also need to understand that food security has been a big issue in China. And I'm 30, and so I'm like the first generation who grew up can basically eat whatever I want. But famine is still a very fresh memory in the Chinese public. And so there is this anxiety with regards to the access to food and whether that is safe, what is being put into the body. And then there is also this anxiety with regards to the rapid development and with regards to changes to the ecosystem. And I think these are not exclusive to China, and a lot of these anxieties with regards to new technology, some of them are paranoid level fears, are also this kind of deeply rooted anxiety in the public with regards to what we are doing to nature and what is the effects of it.
Do we know, are there any sort of public surveys, or has there been any kind of proactive public engagement around genome editing in China? Or how do we know what the public perception is? Has it been quantified, or is this something that is emerging sort of as an ethos, or as the voices that are coming to the fore in social media or in other places in the news? Has this been addressed by scholars at all to try and identify, quantify public opinion, and then similarly, is there any sort of proactive engagement of the public on the topic of genome editing in health or agriculture?
Okay, maybe I try to answer some of your question,
Sure.
some part of your question. So far as I know, I did not see any reports or any study on the public perception to the gene editing, but for the biotech, several government-funded research agency has conducted a study before, maybe several years ago or many years ago. They have conducted several rounds of studies. Yeah, and then for the gene editing engagement, proactive engagement, I think in China is actually the first workshop or the earliest is being conducted by CropLife China as an industry association, and then start from 2017 now with the ISF, the International Seed Federation. They organize gene editing research and policy workshop every year in together with the China Seed Association and the China Seed and the Trade Association. So these are the public, how can I say, is the industry association hosted, organized workshop in China, discussing about the R&D and also about the regulatory. And then for the local Chinese research agency, and also there are several local private funded gene editing company, I think their majority, the focus areas is R&D only research, but not really much work on policy issue.
And I want to pick up on one other thing that I heard you, Yang, and Larry both touched on is sort of the reasons behind the public opinion and what the concerns are. So often in the US, we hear there's a lot of concern around genetically modified organisms. And it's often connected to sort of the values of who has ownership and intellectual property, concerns about corporate control of food and who's benefiting. Are those the same concerns that you're hearing in the public opinion in China, or it sounds like it may also be more about the safety of the food and concerns about what's going into the body? How do you see that landscape of concerns, particularly around kind of power, control, and intellectual property concerns? I don't know who wants to go first, but jump in. Oh, Larry, you're mute, actually.
I think that's a really good question. And one of the challenges of doing social scientific research in China is that it's very hard to do survey research. Getting questions approved is also very hard. Finding local partners to ask the questions is very hard. So what's left mostly is more qualitative works, right? So going to interviews, going to venues where these issues might be discussed. So conferences by rare patient disease organizations. There was one recently held that was online, so that was great. So I could sit in and learn. But I think one of the things that Yaya touched on previously that was pretty on point was the concern over biosecurity, right? And it's some work that an anthropologist at UC Berkeley is doing recently, Yaya Wang, who looks at the rise in the use of non-human primate models for gene editing, right? China has a large operation of gene editing for monkeys, for pigs, some of it for agricultural purposes, the pig side, but mostly a lot of it is ambitions to create disease models that are then applied to human diseases, right? That largely is spurred by the decline of these non-human primate models used in the West. A lot of it because of protests from PETA and like other animal rights organizations. But in China, the similar concerns about animal welfare, a lot of people say are not as prevalent, largely because of this feeling that when there are a lot of people suffering in poverty, when there's a lot of people suffering from these diseases, why would you care about animal welfare and rights when there are all these things happening, right? So that's one thing to think about, I think, when we're talking about diseases in China. A lot of these justifications are taken from this line of thinking. Whether they're right or not is up for debate, I think, and requires a lot more, I think, empirical examination of what people actually say and think, which unfortunately is very hard to do in China. But I think a lot of it also has to do with a broader question of what these technologies do, right? And these are the same questions in the West, in the US, in Europe, about the questions of trust, right? If I think the attitude of scientists coming into this is that you have to educate the public to make them understand the questions better, then they'll accept these technologies. Then I think we've lost half the battle, right? Part of it is also to understand what the public sees as legitimate use of these technologies, for them to intervene, to step in and say, should these technologies be used at all? It's not just shaping the implication of technologies, but also shaping the development of technologies and whether or not these technologies should be used in the first place. But that in China, still hard to see and find opportunities for those types of engagements to take place.
Yeah, and if I may follow up on Larry's excellent point about animal rights, about this perception and the difference in regulations. And it is true that in China it is much easier to carry out these animal-based experiments, especially using larger primates. And I think one thing that we should also note is the Chinese government's talent recruitment through the Chinese government's talent recruitment programs. A significant number of scientists in the West, whether or not they are of Chinese origin, have chosen to take advantage of this relatively lax bioethics environment and conduct these experiments in China. Right? For example, like the first cloned monkeys were done by the scientist led by the team Mu Bingpu, who left the American institution to work in China, and so I think we shouldn't essentialize and thinking Chinese people and Chinese scientists are somehow lax in their ethical standards, because we are seeing scientists of China, they probably don't, they might also not have a strong moral objection towards particular regulations, but they were abiding by their government's rules. But then weaknesses in bioethics anywhere would threaten biosecurity everywhere. And then another point I wanted to mention with regards to animal rights is, I think there is also a very clear, very prevalent racist and neo-colonial view towards treatment of animals by non-white communities, and I think that also colors this perception towards how animals are used in China, and how and some of the Western critique towards bioethics in China, and it's conflated with also like indigenous food habits, etc. And so I think that should also be taken into account in seeing how public opinion is shaped both inside China and also outside.
It sounds like you're also touching a little bit on concerns about medical tourism, for example. So as we think about sort of global policy and how one country's regulations and policy may not only influence that one country, it may influence kind of the actions of the global landscape of research and trials in particular. Is that something that is on the minds of people and of regulators in China? How are they seeing the role of medical tourism? So an example of that, in the US, there is very tight regulation around mitochondrial transfer, for example, and we've seen some instances where a technology has been developed, it's not allowed in the US, and so then a individual or a small company pops up somewhere else where the regulation is allowed, and people from the US will go there to get the mitochondrial transfer and then come back. So it's sort of this finding the place where there is the most permissive regulation, and then people will go there to access it. And that raises some concerns about ethics, but also, you know, it's potentially an economic strategy. I'm wondering if this is something that any of you have thought, if this is something that has come up in China. How is this thought about?
I'll comment really quickly. It's not directly related to gene editing technology, but okay, two examples that partly related. The first is we mentioned He Jiankui's recruitment of HIV positive couples for fertility treatment because it's not prohibited in China, and some of the couples who were approached or participating in his experiment at different stages, they have thought about, like, for example, going to Thailand to get sperm washing so that they can, because there is safe and effective technology for HIV positive couples to have healthy children, but they couldn't get that kind of treatment in China. And so that is an example. And then another thing that's not directly related to gene editing, but something I think about a lot is, for example, China doesn't allow unmarried women to get to freeze their eggs and this and that, and some more younger women with resources would choose to go abroad and receive these kinds of reproductive care. And so, these are some of the examples I would mention. But I think what is very important to keep in mind in this conversation when we are focusing on China and regulations in China, but we should understand that it's something that cannot be done by any singular country, and we really need to be able to reimagine how to form transnational governance of these new technologies, because the effects are always global.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, can I add something more about this? Actually, for the gene editing, the baby or not baby, embryo, human being embryo, China has a very strict policy. The issue is that Dr. He Jiankui, he did not follow, or maybe he did not aware, because for any kind of human being embryo can be only for like less than 14 days, cannot culture it over 14 days. So it's very clear on this, because when this event happened, I checked on the regulation. They said it's not older than 14 days. It's very clear, but he just ignored it, or he may did not know it. So it's not the government policy encourage this kind of things happen. It's himself. He's this individual scientist.
Yes,
he
and
did not follow
I've read as well that there may be multiple regulations that are, in fact, on the books in China that would make his actions illegal, but that perhaps was he ignoring them? Were they enforceable? There was maybe some questions about enforceability. I've read that, for example, there might have been regulations specifically against modification and implantation, which is very specific. So Judy, you're mentioning something that is really an international norm. It's been put into many of the international societies' governance frameworks around, started with cloning really, but around how long we can culture embryos, because at what point do we start to raise concerns about the ethics of culturing those embryos in a dish? And 14 days is really kind of the international standard for that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, when we think about motivations here, and very much the reaction of the scientific community was swift. International scientific community was swift to condemn what He Jiankui did, and really started to call him out as a rogue scientist. And Judy, as you're mentioning, the fact that there were some regulations that he ignored or chose not to follow, I think that is an important context for why he's also being called as a rogue scientist by many in China. But there's also some that have pushed back on that idea that he acted alone, or that he is somehow, unique or different than other scientists in the world, really, who are driven by things like pursuit of fame and pursuit of international recognition and driving new technologies forward. And I think he himself said that he really expected praise for what he had done, that he knew that people were not ready, but by taking this step, he was moving the technology forward and he was advancing the fields. And in the end, people would kind of thank him for that. I know Judy, Yang Yang, you've kind of touched on this before, but this concept of rogue versus, non-rogue, and really how did this happen, and is it a rogue scientist, and how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot, because partly I also think that he came from quite a similar background as I did, and though I didn't know him personally, we have interacted in similar social circles, and so I think this is partly also I myself need to reflect on my own complicity by way of my education, right? If He Jiankui were uniquely evil, then he is in jail and he would not work again, and then it absolves all of us. But that is not how the world works. that is not how we should think about ethics. An individual makes mistakes, and that is less interesting when we are thinking about governance. And so first of all, he was not particularly secretive in his plans, and I think that is a very important thing to take note. As mentioned before, right, China has a tightly monitored and controlled social environment. If we make an analogy, if He Jiankui was planning a pro-democracy protest, he wouldn't have gotten very far at all. So the very fact of what the government pays attention to and what the government allows tacitly, if without direct directions, shows a degree of prioritizing. And then also he did this with plenty of collaborators in China at different stages. And then I think there is some reports about there was deceitful behavior from him, whether or not the embryologists who implanted the embryos were completely sure whether or not they were gene edited, etc. And he was deceitful to the subjects, the patients he recruited as well at different stages. So there is deception, but it was also a failure of regulation. And another thing I think is very important to point out is if we look beyond China, what has been reported last year, like in Science magazine, right? He had a circle of trust among a very prominent Western scientists in the US, and he kept quite a few of them in the loop from his very beginning of the conception of the idea to different stages of the experiment. And some were horrified and disgusted and tried to dissuade him or try to dissociate themselves from the process. But there were also quite a few, who watched it with curiosity, even though they may be uncomfortable about it in general. But they were also, and I think some of that is also tainted with this, with the race factor, in that there is an exoticized gaze that because this was happening in China on Chinese bodies, these white men were looking at this from the US and thinking, oh, this is interesting. And right after the experiment was done, and then I'm not going to mention names here, someone very prominent emailed someone else very prominent and said it happened in China, where else? And so I think these are all things that international scientific community need to reflect on, and we need to think about with regards to the specific case of He Jiankui's experiment.
And I've heard people comment, and you see in the headlines that came out after that it doesn't say, first baby born, rogue scientist. It says rogue Chinese scientist, and it often, calls out where that came from as part of the incident. And, to your point, Yang, it sounds like there is more going on there of the West versus the East, and sort of, perceptions and what could be described as racism to some extent, and expectations and the way that certain Western individuals view science in China. And I think we've just heard that there's a lot of different exciting scientists happening in China. Scientists themselves have come out against what happened with He Jiankui. So as you've mentioned, his actions do not characterize the whole of Chinese science. And so I find that very interesting that you're looping that thread into what you perceived as happening and how you're thinking about it. Let's see, so we've, the CRISPR babies, very front and center in many people's minds, but let's see if we can address some other aspects. Let's step away from the babies for a little while, and I'd like to maybe go back to just the concept of governance in general. Is there an overarching governance? How does kind of a centralized framework versus regional regulation or governance happen? And to what extent, is there sort of all scientists working under one ethical code and one set of regulations in China versus, a more piecemeal regulations? For example, I believe many hospitals have their own clinical trial regulations, so it's not a centralized system. So how do you see that playing out in terms of the new innovations coming out of China and where they will happen? Will they be centrally regulated, and how are scientists kind of navigating that landscape? I don't know if anyone wants to take that.
Maybe I can go first, but maybe I just leave the health or gene cloning animal section to Yang and Larry. For the gene edited crops, mainly is very will be one policy in China, and will be regulated by the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, we call MARA. And MARA actually is they're actively to collect informations from the other country, learn from the other country and regions. So MARA has set up several projects and assigned some key scientists to even visit the US and to collect information and do a survey about how US regulates gene editing plants and how Argentina, Brazil, and the South American countries regulate gene editing plants, and also collect information from Australia and Japan and the Asia Pacific region. So I think they're really trying to working on it, but for some reason they did not finalize the regulation yet. That's the current situation. But for the gene edited animal and other products, even I think what I heard that even in US, FDA will treat as a regulated product. So I'm not very familiar with this part, but I think China will have our own policy, but I'm not sure it's in general will be overall in a country national policy. Then all the institutions have to follow it. But at the implementation level, I think they may be the different agency. They have their different understanding, but should be in one standard. That's my understanding.
I can talk a little bit about, I think, the role of innovation in all of this. One of the ways to also look at how these products are governed is that there's a lot of emphasis and push for creating indigenous innovations in China. There's different readings of what this actually means. A part of it, I think, is also in a lot of, if you talk to any scientists, there's a lot of stress, right, about producing output anywhere in the world. But in China, these metrics, these systems of evaluation are really taken on a different level. You get bonuses for publishing an article in a higher ranked SCI journal. You get bonuses for getting recognition or invited to conferences overseas if you're working in one of these top fields. So there's a sense that innovation, this push towards it, is going a bit too fast. And in some sense, we're losing a little bit about what substantively innovation means. And a lot of, I think, one thing to flag is that a lot of the organizations that are promoting CRISPR technologies, gene editing technologies, they're the ones who are, so the Ministry of Science and Technology, they're the ones who are funding a lot of this. The National Science Foundation, they're funding a lot of this research. But they're given maybe also the task of monitoring this research, right? So it's hard to draw the lines between people who are pushing for innovation, but people who are tasked with monitoring where innovation should go. And this requires a lot broader consultations. I think there's a lot of draft documents that are still receiving comments around gene therapies and CRISPR technologies, still uncertain. And there's some talk around creating a national ethics and standards board overseen by the Ministry of Science and Technology that would solve some of the kind of arbitrage that's been going on in subnational and local and regional ethics boards.
Yeah, and And if we're talking about like the landscape and whether or not it is even or uneven, it is an uneven landscape with regards to regulations. I think, and especially when you, Leah, you mentioned about the regional divide, I think it's very important to also talk about China's ethnic policy, because as talked earlier, that biomedicine is intimately linked with how the state views as human, and how the state defines and tries to control this collective national body. And we are seeing for the past few years, like the Chinese government is very much diverging from its initially at the founding of the People's Republic had a more inclusive ethnic policy, but now it's increasingly moving towards the direction that there is only one politically correct way to be Chinese, and these ethnic minorities, their language and their culture and their customs needs to be forcefully erased to fit into this this idea of a politically correct Chineseness, and that is very much related with biomedicine and with gene editing, or just like genetics technology as well, right? And so if a Uyghur in the concentration camp doesn't have that same kind of agency towards whether or not they are willing to give their genetic biometric information to the Chinese authorities and how it might be used, compared with a relatively privileged Han Chinese living somewhere in the coastal metropolis. And so if we talk a lot about these racial and class disparities with regards to biotechnology here in the US, and I think it's very important to also think about China in this context. And when we talk about ethnic-based oppression in China, we also need to situate that into a historical and global context.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if anyone wants to elaborate on that or pull off of that thread. Give a second. So in terms of, you know, to your earlier point, Yang, about essentialism, you know, when considering gaining social license for technologies, so, you know, there's, of course, regulation, there's soft governance, regulation would be harder, governance, but social license is a major driver of what actually comes from the bench to the people, right, and what people want. And we see that social license playing out with GMO regulations being more strict, partly in response to the perceptions of the public. So in terms of gaining kind of social license for technologies, can the panelists talk to what is truly unique in China versus how one might think about it in other countries? So there's, you know, obviously going to be similarities, but what is something that's really unique about gaining social license, or the way that the public in China is perceiving these new technologies, or the way that that license is gained even would be an interesting topic to discuss. And if anyone wants to take that. Larry, can I call in you?
Construction going upstairs, so there might be a lot of noise.
Sure.
But social license, I presume that means getting public approval to use these technologies, right? Okay. What's different about it? I think, yeah, like in the US and in Europe, and also in a lot of efforts pioneered by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, there are increasingly different modes of public engagement exercises. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of it that's still, as I said before, done in the model of a deficit model of public understanding of science. So it's done in the ways that are through a kopu, or like science popularization or science education. So these are assuming that that the public doesn't understand these technologies, right? So I think how to aggregate social interest, how to aggregate public opinions, this requires a lot more openness from the state's part, but also from the scientists' part, to recognize that they don't know anything, right? Sheila Jasanoff, who's a scholar at Harvard, calls these technologies of humility. So these are moments where scientists recognize that they have their own limitations, that they need guidance from what the public views as right and wrong. And I think we don't exactly have to copy like American ways of holding like town halls or public engagement exercises, but there are different creative ways of allowing for these debates to happen more freely and more openly, right? It's chaotic. It's hard to find consensus. We've had dialogues over and over again about gene editing globally, and we have barely started to come across a rollout plan. But in China, yeah, it's still hard to imagine what that process looks like. And perhaps it might take another incident like He Jiankui and a little bit more openness for debate to really understand what the limitations and what people actually want.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about whether or not it's something unique in China, I think it's important to point out that it's not, if there is a condition that is particular to China or particularly serious in China, it's not because Chinese people are different, but it's because of the social conditions and the policies that shaped their perception. So I think one thing that, on the biomedicine side, one thing that is very important, I mentioned earlier about food, right? The mindset of scarcity. And in biomedicine, right, the medical resources in China is extremely scarce and extremely unevenly distributed, and so in that would very much affect a person's attitude towards medicine. And as Larry mentioned earlier about these experimental treatments with gene editing technology, especially in cancer treatments, and a lot of these treatments, they may be the patients may be more willing to take it because just healthcare in general are difficult to get. And also the healthcare providers themselves, it also shapes their mindset, right? Remember, there is a very memorable quote from an NPR story about gene editing cancer trials in China, and there was this patient the doctor who said, if they don't get this treatment, they would die. This was probably true if they're terminally ill, but just being terminally ill doesn't just reduce them into a medical experimental subject. On the other hand, there is something very memorable. Was one patient who said, "I'm not worried. I trust science." And so I think this public perception towards science, on one hand, is shaped by this long-term entrenched scarcity, and they would like to think that science is what can modernize the country and bring up the level, the quality of life. And so there is this trust towards science because of this. But on the other hand, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, this anxiety towards GMOs, etc., and that is also because there is also the fear about whether or not China is developing too fast and we're pushing things too fast and we're making irreparable mistakes in this process as well.
So we have only a couple minutes left, but I do want to ask you, Judy, I think it's interesting, this perhaps juxtaposition of attitudes towards trusting science and seeing science as kind of a savior of the scarcity and of lack of access to medical care, that in fact in health it's maybe seen as this opportunity, but as you expressed, Judy, that science in food is maybe seen differently. How could you quickly maybe talk about how that is contrasting the health attitudes in China towards technology and health versus attitudes in China technology and food, and particularly in crops for you? Are you seeing sort of a different way of viewing the role of technology, and how does that play out with the scarcity of food?
Yeah, I think the way of look at the food in China is that first the people are concerned about the food security. So always try to say that we have to. The government now have a slogan that we have to hold the bowl filled with the food which is produced in China, produced by ourselves. So the food security is still a top priority for the government and also for the general public. And for the difference of, you mean difference of?
Yeah, I guess just so Yang just described sort of a general sentiment, a positive sentiment towards using technology in medicine, in health, but you had described the opposite, a negative sentiment towards using technology in food.
Yes.
And I wonder
Yes.
if that idea of scarcity that Yang mentioned
Yes.
is connected with that. And it sounds like you're saying that the
Yeah.
security aspect is a part of that attitude.
Yeah, I think the genetic modified medicines people are using because they're sick. They're sick. They feel if it's sick, it's better we use this medicine. And also, some people may don't aware this medicine is genetically modified at all from fermentation, from genetically modified microorganism. They don't aware this at all. And some of the unique things, I think, your earlier question about China is, I feel the public people they don't if they want to looking for something they don't want to look at this information from the public media. They want to from some private media or some social media. They trust more on social media rather than the public scientific media. So that's a big issue, I think. So some of the private media may deliver some rumor stories that will misleading the public
well, let's maybe go around. Final closing remarks. Any thoughts you want to leave the audience with, and then I will turn it over to Mallory. Let's start, Larry, with you.
Thank you for having everyone else for a great conversation. And I think, just to leave an optimistic note, Chinese scientists are good people. They want to produce good science. They want to contribute to their country. They want to also contribute to scientific progress globally. So when I talk to them, engage with them as who they are, see them as where they are, the limitations and what they aspire to be, and engage with them that way. And I think that can really help with a lot of the problems and the lack of communication globally that we see. And also recognize that science doesn't happen in a vacuum, that what happens in China happens because of things that are happening around the world as well.
Great. And Yang, a thought to close out on?
So I want to say that diversity is extremely important in science, including geographical diversity. And I think Chinese scientists being part of this global conversation is extremely important. And I'll borrow a concept from the urban scholar Aniana Roy about the 3 Ps. So she called personhood, property, and the police. And I think these are 3 very important concepts when we think about biomedicine as well, how the body is being defined and how that may be commercialized and commodified, and how that may be used for state control and state surveillance.
And Judy, final thoughts for the audience.
Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you for the audience on the line. And it's a very good communication and conversation. And I hope and I think that China finally will adopt a very good regulation toward the gene editing products, science-based regulation, and let this good technology be applied in agriculture and promote the
Thank you all for joining us. This has been very enlightening and a great conversation with you all. I'm going to turn it over to Mallory.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for a great conversation. Something we say often with CRISPR-Con is that we don't really aim for CRISPR-Con to provide answers so much as raise additional important questions. And I think this panel did a really good job of that. So I appreciate you all being here, Yang, Larry, and Judy as our speakers, and Lee as our moderator. Feel free to leave the video feed if you'd like as I go through closing remarks, although I hope some of you will be able to stick around for the breakout discussions. But bye for now. So just again, on behalf of Keystone, thank you. Thanks, Judy. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to our moderator, and thank you to all of our audience. We had great engagement among the audience today. And also thanks to our sponsors who make these sessions possible. We'll have this session available on our YouTube channel within 24 hours if you'd like to share it. We do have a panel discussion coming up on Thursday, another session focused on hope and hype, this one focused specifically on what's in the agriculture pipeline. And now we're going to transition right into an ideas marketplace session with small group discussions led by some of our participants. So in past sessions, we've built in a little bit of a break, but for this, we're going to transition relatively immediately, although if you need to stretch or grab a drink or take a quick break, you're welcome to do so. But for those of you who are interested in sticking around, the breakout discussions will be taking place in the sessions section of Hopin. And to join an Ideas Marketplace conversation, you click that sessions button on the left-hand navigation bar, and then you'll have 3 different breakout sessions to choose from. You can connect directly by sharing your audio and video, and up to 20 people can join a discussion. It's a great chance to connect with other participants and continue the conversation. Several of the sessions build fairly directly on the kinds of things we talked about today. One of the sessions is posing a question about policies and regulations and what kinds of things China can do that others can't. A second session is comparing Chinese and Western philosophical and religious perspectives. And the third is focused on an algorithm under development that could make any chemical product in any host organism and exploring the ethics of that. So a great set of options there for additional discussion. And with that, that concludes our content on the main stage today. But I hope to see some of you over in the sessions tab, and hope to see you all continuing to engage on Twitter at #CRISPRCon2020, and also on Thursday at our next session. And know that you can always register for future sessions at CRISPRCon.org. So thanks again to everyone for participating today. And please continue the conversation.